The night was cold and quiet, and the wind made a soft sound as it moved through the broken trees and empty houses, and the sky had no moon, only stars that looked like they were hiding behind clouds, and the world felt like it had forgotten how to smile, because the war had taken everything away from people and from places and from time itself. And in the middle of all this silence there was one man who lived alone in a small wooden cabin near the forest edge, and his name was Daniel, and he was not young anymore, and he had tired eyes and strong hands and the heart that still remembered how to care. He had fought in the war, but now he just wanted peace, and he spent his days fixing his tools, growing vegetables, and trying not to remember the screams and fire and blood. And at night he would sit by the fire and eat simple food like soup or bread or roasted roots, and sometimes he would keep the leftovers in a metal plate and leave it outside for animals, because deep inside he knew the forest still had hungry creatures who didn't deserve to starve one night. As he placed a piece of dry bread and beans on the plate and turned back inside, he heard a sound, not loud, not sharp, just a soft shuffle, like someone stepping on dry leaves very slowly and carefully. And he paused and looked through the window, but saw nothing, and yet something told him to stay quiet and observe. And so he sat down by the window and watched the plate through the glass without moving. And after a few minutes he saw Ida's small figure stepped out from the shadows of the trees, very thin, very slow, and wrapped in something that looked like torn fabric or maybe old skin, and it crawled more than walked toward the food, and its body shivered, as if afraid of every step. And when it reached the plate, it stopped and looked around, and Daniel saw two big eyes glowing faintly, not with anger, not with wildness, but with something else. Maybe fear, maybe pain, maybe hunger. The creature reached out and touched the bread like it was a dream, and then pulled back and looked around again, and then again tried to grab it, this time faster, as if it could not resist any more. And Daniel could see now that this was not an animal and not a monster and not a machine, but a girl, a small alien girl, maybe 10 years old, maybe less. Her skin was light blue, and her face had thin lines glowing like stars, and her hair was rough and short and silver like moonlight. She grabbed the bread and began to eat, not like a thief, but like someone who had not eaten in days. And Daniel could see her hands were shaking and her eyes were wet, and she kept looking left and right as if someone would punish her for surviving. And something inside Daniel cracked a little, something old, something soft, and he stood up slowly and opened the door without sound and stepped outside, holding a blanket in one hand and a small bowl of warm soup in the other. Girl froze the moment she saw him, and her whole body tensed like she would run. But Daniel did not move fast or talk or shout. He just knelt down slowly and placed the bowl on the ground and the blanket beside it, and then stepped back and sat on the wooden step of his porch and waited. The girl did not run. She looked at the soup, then at him, then at the soup again, and slowly crawled toward it. She sniffed it, as if she had never smelled anything like that before, and then dipped her fingers into it and tasted, and her eyes went wide. And then she ate and drank and didn't stop until the bowl was empty, and her lips trembled and her hands were wet, and she wiped her face with her sleeve and looked at Daniel. He did not speak. He just nodded once, and she nodded back and stood up and turned and walked back into the shadows without a word. And Daniel watched her go, and then looked at the empty bowl and plate and smiled for the first time in many weeks. The next morning the plate was still outside, but now it was clean, and beside it was something strange, a small flat stone with a drawing on it, two hands touching, one big, one small, and a star above them. And Daniel held it in his hand and felt something stir inside him, something warm, something alive. That night he placed another bowl of soup and a bigger piece of bread and sat by the window and waited again. The wind moved gently through the trees, and the sky was lighter than usual, and Daniel stood at his window with a feeling he could not explain, and his eyes kept moving toward the edge of the forest where the girl had vanished last night. And he still held the small stone in his hand with the strange drawing, two hands and one star, and it felt like a message, maybe a thank you, maybe something more. And he kept it near the window beside the plate where he now placed warm soup bread and one apple, because he remembered her face and how her eyes had changed after tasting something kind. He sat on the porch and waited, and the sun moved slowly across the sky, and the shadows changed shape, and time passed, but Daniel stayed because something in his heart told him that she would come again, and as the orange of evening began to touch the trees, he heard a sound not from the ground but from above, like a soft hum, like air being sliced and disturbed by something flying with care. From behind the thick bush stepped the little girl, but this time she was not alone, and behind her walked another figure, taller, stronger, more guarded, her skin a deeper shade of blue and her eyes sharper and her arms wrapped in cloth that shimmered with dust and time, and Daniel could tell this was the girl's mother, and she did not look pleased or grateful or even curious. She looked cautious and tired and ready to leave. The girl smiled and pointed at Daniel, and then looked up at her mother and said something in her own language, something that sounded soft and quick like rain on metal, and the woman responded with one short word that Daniel did not understand. But it felt like a question, and the girl nodded and stepped forward toward Daniel, who stood up slowly and gave a slight wave. Nothing big, nothing strange, just enough to say, "I remember." Youth girl moved to the plate, picked up the apple, held it with both hands and took a small bite, and then looked at her mother again and said something else, and the woman now took one step forward and spoke in English, not perfect but clear enough, and she said, "You are the one who gave her food?" And Daniel nodded and said yes, and then added she was hungry and scared, and I had enough to share. The mother looked at him for a long time and then lowered her gaze and said, "We do not ask, we do not beg, we do not stay long." And Daniel nodded again and said, "I understand, and you do not have to stay if it is not safe, and I will not ask questions." And the girl stepped beside her mother and held her hand and whispered again, and the mother hesitated and looked at the cabin and then at the sky and then back at Daniel. She said, "They will come looking for us. They do not like peace. They do not like kindness." And Daniel asked, "Who are they?" And she replied, "The ones who followed us from the wreck. The ones who hunt survivors. The ones who hate your kind and mine." And Daniel looked at the trees and then at her and asked, "Are you in danger?" And she answered, "Always." The little girl tugged on her mother's hand and looked at Daniel and asked in broken English, "Can we stay here just for one night?" And Daniel paused and then said yes, and the mother looked at him again, as if reading his soul, and then nodded once and said, "We leave before sunrise." And Daniel said, "All right, I will make more food, and there is room in the back of the cabin, and it is warm." That night they sat around the fire, not close but not apart, and the girl ate with joy, and the mother with quiet hands and silent thoughts. And Daniel asked nothing and spoke little, only shared food and warmth. And when the girl laughed once, the mother looked up in surprise, and Daniel smiled without saying a word, and for a moment the silence was not heavy, it was peaceful. Later, when they were resting inside and the fire burned low, the mother sat near the window and watched the stars. And Daniel asked her name, and she said, "Mara," and he said, "I am Daniel," and she said, "I know," and he asked how, and she said, "My daughter heard you talking to the wind last night," and Daniel chuckled and said, "I talk to the wind when I feel alone," and she nodded and said, "Then the wind is your friend for sleep." The girl whispered something to Myra and then walked to Daniel and placed the apple core in his hand and said, "Thank you." And Daniel nodded and said, "You are welcome," and she turned and walked back to her mother. And Myra looked at Daniel and said, "You are not like the others." And he said, "Maybe I forgot how to be human in the war." And she said, "Maybe you remembered tonight." And as they closed their eyes and the cabin grew quiet, Daniel knew deep inside that something had changed and that tomorrow would not be the same as yesterday. The morning was colder than usual, and the sky looked heavy, like it was thinking about rain, and Daniel stood at the door with a blanket in his hands and watched the forest where shadows moved like silent waves, and his eyes searched for the girl and her mother, but there was nothing, only quiet trees and soft wind and a strange feeling inside his chest, like something important had left and taken a part of him. He walked around the cabin, checking the traps, checking the garden, checking the firewood, and trying to keep busy, but every corner of the place now reminded him of small feet running across the floor and a soft voice asking for more soup and eyes that held galaxies in their glow. And he felt foolish for missing someone he had met only twice, but the silence of war had made him treasure every new sound, every spark of life. By noon he gave up waiting and returned to his workbench and began cleaning his old radio, hoping maybe he could catch something, anything, maybe another voice, maybe a warning, maybe a reason to hope. And as he adjusted the dial, a soft knock echoed through the cabin, soft enough to be a dream but strong enough to freeze his breath. and when he opened the door he found the girl standing there, alone, holding a piece of torn cloth in one hand and shaking from cold and fear. Before he could speak, she said one word, "Help," and Daniel stepped aside without question and let her in, and she sat near the fire and pointed to the forest and said they came, and Daniel felt his hands clench and his heart race, and he asked who, and she said bad ones with metal and lights, and they tried to take her mother, and she ran, and now she did not know where her mother was, and her voice broke and her small hands covered her face. Daniel knelt beside her and gently moved her hands and said, "We will find her, and you are safe here." And she looked at him with eyes full of tears and trust, and he knew this was no longer just kindness, this was something deeper, something that asked him to stand again and fight again, not for nations, not for medals, but for people who needed someone to believe in them. He packed a small bag with supplies and took his old rifle and his flashlight and gave the girl a piece of bread and said, "Wait here and do not open the door for anyone unless it is me." And she nodded and wrapped herself in the blanket, and Daniel stepped into the forest, following the trail of broken branches and disturbed soil and soft marks that glowed faintly under the trees. The deeper he went, the darker it became, and the silence turned strange, like the forest was holding its breath, and he moved slow and careful, listening for anything that did not belong, and soon he heard it, a low hum, like machines breathing, and he crouched behind a fallen tree and saw them, two tall figures with armor that shimmered in the light, and eyes that glowed red, and hands holding weapons that hummed with energy, and beside them a third figure on the ground, bound and silent, and it was Myra. Daniel did not wait. He pulled a stone from his bag and threw it to the side, and the sound made one guard turn, and in that moment, Daniel moved like wind, like fire, like something old and sharp and full of purpose, and he hit the first guard with the butt of his rifle, and the second turned too late, and Daniel used his knife, and the silence returned. But now it was heavy with breath and heartbeats. He ran to Myra and cut the binds, and she looked at him with wide eyes and said, "You came?" And he said, "Of course." And she said, "Why?" And he said, "Your daughter said help," and that was enough. And she tried to stand, but her leg was hurt, and Daniel lifted her without a word and carried her through the forest, back to the cabin, where the girl opened the door and ran to her mother and cried into her arms. That night they did not eat much, and they did not talk much, but the fire was warm, and the cabin was full of something stronger than fear, something that held them together like invisible threads made of trust and sacrifice. And in the quiet, Daniel looked at them and said, "You can stay as long as you need." And Myra said, "Trust is hard." And Daniel said, "Yes, but sometimes it starts with Supreme." Touched the roof like soft fingers playing an old tune, and inside the cabin the fire danced low, and the little girl slept with her head on her mother's lap, and her breathing was slow and steady and peaceful, like she had found something she thought was lost forever. And Daniel sat across from them with a cup of warm tea in his hands, and his eyes fixed on the flames that rose and fell like old memories rising from ashes outside. The trees swayed with the weight of the wind, and the night whispered things that only the lonely could hear, and inside the silence was not empty. It was full of thoughts and scars and stories waiting to be spoken. And after a long pause, Myra looked at Daniel and asked, "How long since your war ended?" And Daniel answered, 2 years, maybe more, maybe less." And Myra looked down at her daughter and said, "Ours never ends." Her voice was soft, but inside it was heavy, like a ship carrying the weight of loss across galaxies. And Daniel leaned forward and asked what happened. And Myra looked into the fire and said, "We were told Earth was dangerous and violent and full of poison, and we should never come close, and we believed it until our planet cracked open like an egg under pressure, and the air turned against us, and the oceans became glass, and we had nowhere to go." Daniel listened without a word, and his tea grew cold in his hands. And Myra continued, "Some of us came here in secret, in hope and silence, but not all of us agreed, and some of our own betrayed us too. Those who wanted war and said Earthlings were the enemy and should be feared and destroyed." And Daniel said, "I fought in that war, and I saw ships fall and cities burn, and I still hear the screams when I sleep." Myra nodded and said, "We lost our home, and then our people, and then our hope. And when I met your kind, I thought I would lose my daughter too, but she saw something I could not, and she said you were kind, and I thought she was wrong until you came for me with nothing to gain and everything to lose, and now I sit here and wonder if maybe peace is possible after all." Daniel looked at the little girl and said, "Children do not lie about kindness, and sometimes they see What grown people have forgotten how to see, and Myra said she reminds me of her father, and Daniel asked, where is he now? And Myra said, gone, taken during the first attack by those who believed in power, not peace. And I held her tight and ran and never looked back. Daniel stood up and walked to the shelf and picked up an old photo, a picture of a boy in a uniform with a big smile and bright eyes, and he handed it to Myra and said, this was my brother. He died protecting children from a falling building during the invasion, and I sometimes wish it was me because he was better and younger and more brave. And Myra took the photo gently and said, maybe the brave are not the ones who fight, but the ones who keep living. Thunder rolled across the sky like a giant beast waking from sleep, and the fire flickered, and shadows moved along the walls, and the little girl turned in her sleep and whispered something that made Myra hold her closer. And Daniel added more wood to the fire and said, you can stay here as long as you want, and I will help keep her safe. And Myra said, I believe you, and that is something I never thought I would say to a human. Hours passed, and the rain became heavy, and the roof sang louder, and the night stretched its arms across the land, and outside in the forest something moved. Not wind, not rain, but something else, something watching and waiting, and Daniel felt it before he heard it, and he reached for his rifle, and Myra stood up slowly and took her daughter in her arms and whispered, stay quiet. Daniel opened the door slowly and looked into the darkness, and at first saw nothing, but then in the far trees a flicker of red eyes, watching, not attacking, not speaking, just watching. And Daniel stepped outside, and the rain hit his face like tiny needles, and he held his rifle tight and stared back, and after a moment the eyes blinked and vanished into the woods, and Daniel stood there for a long time until the forest fell silent again. He returned inside wet and cold and angry and said, they know. And Myra said, yes, they always know. And Daniel said, then we prepare. And Myra nodded and said, we prepare together. The night returned darker than before, and the rain had stopped, but the ground still held the smell of water and earth. And Daniel sat by the door sharpening a blade in silence, while Myra patched a blanket using thread pulled from her daughter's old shirt, and the little girl hummed softly as she drew stars on the wooden floor, using a piece of charcoal in each line. She made seem to shine under the dim lantern, as if her touch carried a kind of forgotten magic. The air was still but not calm, and Daniel could feel something waiting just beyond the trees, like a breath held too long or a word trapped behind clenched teeth. And he had felt this before during the war, when danger crept close, wrapped in silence and hidden behind the eyes of those who smiled before striking. And Myra felt it too, and her hands never stopped moving, but her ears tilted ever so slightly, and her gaze kept drifting to the window. Daniel stood and checked the rifle again, not for the first time, and walked around the cabin, slowly marking each entry point, checking each lock and every nail. And outside, the world had turned to shadows and whispers, and he could almost hear footsteps in the soil, though nothing moved in sight. And the girl asked, why do you keep walking? And Daniel said, I am listening. And she smiled and said, I do that too when I'm scared. And Myra said, you do not need to be scared tonight. And Daniel said, maybe you do. A sudden flicker made the lantern blink, and the girl dropped her charcoal, and Myra rose in one swift motion, and Daniel grabbed the rifle and moved to the door. But it was not the wind. This time it was something else, something mechanical and watching and waiting. And Daniel whispered, stay behind the table and keep your head down and do not speak. And Myra obeyed without question and pulled her daughter close, her body shielding the small frame like a wall of living armor. Then it came a sound, sharp and unnatural, like metal grinding against stone. And Daniel stepped outside and pointed the rifle toward the trees, and at first he saw only branches swaying, but then he caught it a shape taller than a man, covered in armor that shimmered like wet glass and red eyes glowing like blood under moonlight. And it stepped forward slowly, scanning the cabin and the trees, and Daniel held his breath and waited. The figure stopped and tilted its head as if sniffing the air, and then it took one step closer, and Daniel fired once, and the shot echoed across the woods, and the figure stumbled but did not fall, and it raised its arm, and a beam of blue light shot toward the cabin door and missed by inches, burning the edge of the wooden frame. And Myra shouted, Daniel, and he moved without thinking, grabbing a metal rod and charging toward the machine. He struck its side and sparks flew, and the machine turned and struck him across the chest. with a force that sent him flying into the mud, and he coughed but stood again and fired another shot this time, hitting the machine's eye, and it screamed not like a human but like a creature of wire and pain, and it fell to one knee, and Daniel rushed again, this time aiming for the neck, and with a final strike he drove the rod into a gap between plates. And the machine stopped moving. Myra ran outside and helped Daniel to his feet, and he wiped the blood from his mouth and said, "They found us," and she said, "They sent scouts and more will come," and Daniel said, "Then we cannot stay here," and the girl walked out holding a small bag already packed and said, "We go now," and Daniel looked at her and then at Myra and then at the trees and nodded. They moved fast through the forest, taking only what they could carry and leaving behind the home that had become more than shelter, and the stars above watched them with quiet eyes, and the earth beneath carried their steps like it remembered them, and the wind moved ahead like a guide, and behind them the cabin stood empty and broken and quiet, and the metal body of the intruder lay still, without a voice, without a purpose. They walked until the sky began to change and the stars began to fade, and Myra said, "I know a place where they do not go," and Daniel said, "Then lead the way and I will follow," and the girl held Daniel's hand and said, "You are strong and brave," and Daniel smiled but said nothing, because words were heavy and breath was short, and all that mattered now was moving forward. The forest was darker now, and every step felt like it echoed through the roots of the trees, and Myra led the way with quiet speed, while Daniel stayed behind her, watching the shadows and listening for anything that did not belong, and the little girl walked between them, holding a small glowing stone that pulsed with gentle light and cast shapes on the leaves that looked like old memories trying to find their way home. They had left the cabin far behind, and the ground beneath them was soft and uneven, and the wind carried the scent of rain and something sharper, something metallic and distant, like the breath of machines hunting through the night. And Daniel gripped his weapon tight and asked, "How far is this safe place?" And Myra answered, "Through the trees beyond the ridge where the land breaks, and the sky opens, and no one dares follow." And Daniel nodded, though he could not see her face, and kept walking. Hours passed like days, and the cold grew teeth and bit through their clothes, and the girl began to shiver but did not complain, and Myra wrapped her cloak tighter around her and whispered words in her own tongue that sounded like comfort and fire, and Daniel kept watching the rear, his eyes catching every flicker, every sound, every leaf that fell too quickly, and he knew something was close. Not seen, not heard, but felt deep in the bones. Suddenly, the girl stumbled and cried out, and Myra stopped and lifted her, and Daniel knelt and checked the path and found nothing sharp, nothing broken, but the girl's face was pale and her lips dry. And Myra said, "Her energy is fading and she needs rest," and Daniel said, "We cannot stop, not yet, not here," and Myra looked at the trees and said, "We will make a shelter under that rock and move again at dawn." They hid beneath a wide overhang where the earth curved like a cradle, and Daniel started a fire with broken twigs and a piece of cloth, and Myra held her daughter close and tried to feed her something from a silver pouch, but the girl turned her face away, and Daniel reached into his pack and pulled out a dried fruit and said she liked this before, and Myra took it and placed it in the girl's hand, and the girl opened her eyes and smiled weakly. The night grew deeper, and the wind howled like old ghosts calling across the stars, and Daniel sat awake while Myra dozed with her arm around her child, and his eyes scanned the darkness until they burned, and then he heard it, a branch snapping to the left, and not by accident and not by nature, and he stood with his weapon raised and waited, breath held and heart loud, and from the shadows a figure appeared, but it was not a machine. It was a trader wearing patchwork clothes and goggles, and he held up his hands and said, "I mean no harm," and Daniel said, "Then keep walking," and the trader said, "I know what she is, and I have something that might help," and Daniel narrowed his eyes and said, "Why would you help?" And the trader said, "Because I once had a daughter and I could not save her, but maybe this time someone can." Daniel lowered his weapon just a little, and the trader reached into his coat and pulled out a small vial with glowing liquid and said, "This is not magic, it is medicine made from the old days when humans and offworlders worked together before everything broke. And it can restore energy for a short time, just enough to move again." And Daniel took it and looked at Myra, and she looked at the vial and then at Daniel and nodded once they gave the girl the medicine, and slowly her eyes opened wider and her breath steadied and her fingers moved, and she whispered, "Thank you," and the trader smiled and said, "That is enough for me," and then he vanished into the trees like smoke in wind, and Daniel looked where he had gone and said, "The world still has strange kindness in it," and Myra said, "Maybe it is not strange, maybe it is just rare." At sunrise they moved again, and the light broke through the trees like hope spilling from the sky, and the path grew steeper and rocks tore at their boots, and the girl, now awake and quiet, held onto Daniel's shoulder as they climbed, and finally they reached the top of the ridge and saw a valley hidden and deep with walls of green and water glowing blue, and Myra said, "This is it," and here they cannot follow. Daniel looked around and saw no machines, no scouts, no signs of war, and for the first time in many nights, he breathed without fear, and the girl took his hand and said, "This place feels like stories," and Daniel smiled and said, "Maybe we will write our own now." The hidden valley welcomed them like an open hand reaching from the earth, and the air smelled clean, like fresh leaves after rain, and the light touched the trees in soft golden waves, and Daniel stood at the edge of the cliff looking down at the place that would become something more than just a hiding spot, and Myra beside him held her daughter close and said, "This place has not been seen by machines and not even our own kind, and it is sacred and silent and alive." They climbed down slowly, helping each other over stones and through roots that curled like old fingers, and the little girl, now stronger, again walked with her own steps and hummed a song that only she knew, and Daniel smiled at the sound because it felt like peace had a sound, and it was the voice of someone small but brave enough to survive it. At the bottom they found a circle of stone with carvings glowing faintly under the moss, and Myra pressed her palm against one, and it opened a door hidden in the hillside. And inside there was warmth and light and air that smelled of ancient soil and hidden dreams, and they entered slowly, and the door closed behind them like a heartbeat sealing a promise, and Myra said, "Here we can build again days past, and no machines came, and no red eyes watched, and no scouts whispered through the trees." And Daniel helped plant food near the water and built small walls from rock and old tech, and Myra cleaned the space inside and repaired systems that had slept for years. And the little girl decorated the walls with drawings of stars and forests and strange creatures with kind eyes and warm hands. One evening, as the sun slipped behind the hills and shadows danced quietly on the ground, the girl brought a flower she had found and gave it to Daniel and said, "I want you to stay forever." And Daniel looked at her and said, "I will stay as long as you want." And she smiled and said, "Forever then," and ran to show her mother, and Myra watched her with eyes full of softness and fire and said, "She has never laughed this much before." Later that night they sat together near the fire and ate simple food and shared stories without fear, and Daniel told them about Earth before the war and about cities with tall lights and food that danced on hot plates and laughter in places full of music, and Myra spoke of oceans that sparkled under purple moons and gardens where the wind sang through crystals, and her daughter asked, "Can we go there someday?" And Daniel said, "Maybe we can build our own right here." Time moved like a river, slow but strong, and one morning Daniel woke to find the girl sitting outside watching the sky, and when he asked what she was thinking, she said, "I saw a dream that we lived here forever, and no one ever had to hide, and I had a name for this place, and it was home." And Daniel said, "Then home it is." Weeks turned into months, and they built more rooms and planted more seeds, and the systems inside the valley came back to life little by little, and lights blinked and machines hummed, and the place became more than shelter, it became theirs. And Myra began to smile more and speak of teaching and growing, and Daniel fixed a small radio and began to send signals, not for help but for hope. One evening, while adjusting the signal, he heard a voice reply, not loud, not clear, but human, and it said, "Survivors near Orion looking for peace." And Daniel smiled and said, "Then come find it," and shut the radio with hands that no longer tremble. As the stars rose over the valley and the wind wrapped around their home like a soft song, Daniel stood near the fire and watched Myra and her daughter laughing as they played with light stones that floated when tossed just right, and he felt something settle in his chest, not pain, not fear, but something warmer and deeper, and the girl ran to him and hugged his leg and said, "You are like my dad now." And Daniel knelt and said, "Then I am proud to be." Myra came to them and placed her hand on Daniel's shoulder and said, "Family is not always born, sometimes it is made, and sometimes it is chosen, and you chose us." And Daniel said, "You chose me too." And she said, "Then let us keep choosing each other every day." And The sky above a single star blinked brighter than the rest, and the girl pointed and said, "Maybe someone is watching and smiling," and Daniel said, "Maybe someone is watching and learning, and maybe they will remember that peace begins with a meal and a warm fire and a kind heart in the valley." Slept, and the machines never came, and the stars kept shining, and three souls lived. Not just survived, and the world outside kept spinning, but here in this quiet corner of the galaxy, a human and two aliens had built something stronger than war. Stronger than fear, something called family.